Hey, it's Stacey from Healing Collective. I wanted to talk a little bit today about trauma, specifically trauma from a lens of neurodivergence, an expanded way to consider it that is not always, or really isn't, rarely ever looked at by traditional trauma frameworks or treatment frameworks, because the experiences are unique in some ways to a neurodivergent person. Let me share a visual anchor for those who retain or learn a bit better with that option. There we go. So many neurodivergent people spend a whole lot of their day navigating the repeated neuroception or internal perception of danger, not necessarily because their environments are overtly threatening or dangerous, but because it's experienced by their nervous system as unpredictable, overwhelming, unsafe, invalidating, and ongoing activation by that without there being sufficient space or time for rest, repair, and regulation shifts the nervous system to a baseline operating space of survival, of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and creates behaviors that for a lot of neurodivergent people, the experience is that those get labeled by others as things like avoidance or lack of motivation or non-compliance, right? But they're really adaptive survival responses to the ongoing experience of exposure to something that feels dangerous or threatening. So the first of those that I want to look at is sensory. And so this is referring to repeated exposure to sensory experiences that the nervous system feels like are dangerous or threatening on a level that's not just inconvenient, but really experienced by a neurodivergent person as unsafe. So that could be things like navigating crowds, being in a space that's very loud, being in a space that's very bright, being in a space that has multiple stimuli from a lot of different directions to process at once, or even having to attend or attune to something while I'm physically uncomfortable. So why is that traumatic? Because for a person who's neurodivergent, who has sensory differences in processing, and there's repeated and ongoing exposure to some of those, the lived experience is an inability to escape danger, and sometimes even punishment for reacting to something that the nervous system deems dangerous. There's invalidation that goes along with that. Really often, you're fine, stop reacting, you're making excuses, it's not that big of a deal, when the internal nervous system experience of the neurodivergent person is red alert, right? So the perceived requirement to stay right there in the exposure to something dangerous and the inability to get away from it is processed by the nervous system in the body as trauma. The next one I want to look at is social, and it's beyond just bullying, but encompasses confusion, exclusion, misattunement. For this one, this is things like missing hidden rules, not understanding, confusion in social situations, instability in friendships, unpredictability in communication, misreading intentions, being laughed at, or not understanding jokes, being excluded. Why is that traumatic? Because ongoing exposure to those types of experiences instills the belief that there's something wrong with me. Everybody else gets it. Everybody else is on the same page. Everybody else got the memo, and I didn't. What's wrong with me? It's an inability to connect and to co-regulate in a way that produces the chemicals that are needed in order to experience safety. And over time, learning that masking or suppression of my personal experience is the path to safety. So then we have a state of chronic self-abandonment. Suppress what's happening for me so that I can be a part of what's happening for everyone else. The next one on my list is emotional. And this would be consistent experiences of correction, of invalidation, loneliness, shame. Organizing themselves into an identity built in defectiveness and a lack of trust in me. Why is that trauma? When there's a consistent experience of emotional threat or danger, both externally and internally, now it's my experience that I can't trust myself, then I'm once again in a space where survival kicks in and chronically living in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Lack of attunement, lack of attachment, and disconnect from others, disconnect from healthy relationship, and ongoing experience of dysregulation over time creates the experience of trauma. The next one on the list is neurocognitive. And this would be expectations of things like compliance or performance, pushing through executive function demand beyond my capacity, and even unpredictability. Why is this traumatic? Because in those spaces where the expectation is to sit down, be still, be quiet, pay attention, why can't you just XYZ? The identity then becomes connected to achievement rather than belonging. And the experience of failure becomes a loss of safety. There is an experience of communication, my attempts at communication failing to meet my needs. So we're reinforcing masking in order to push through. Comparison and criticism, whether done by someone else or myself, just further invalidate the shame and the lack of trust in self. And when that failure really feels like there's not an out for it, right? That this is just a state of being, that performance and compliance are always going to be the expectation, that I'm always going to be living outside my capacity, that leads to a lived experience of a disconnect with safe self, a disconnect with others, and a loss of autonomy. And the last one on the list that I've got today is medical. And this is one that gets overlooked sometimes. And of course, we could think about medical traumas through things like surgeries or big events, right? But in this sense, I'm thinking about it more from the direction of being misunderstood by providers or dismissed, having my experience dismissed by providers, feeling like an experiment instead of a person. Let's test out this medicine, being talked about instead of to. Why is it traumatic? Because it creates a loss of trust in the people that are supposed to be helping, a reinforcement of masking and suppressing experience, and a reinforcement of dysregulation and discomfort for me being overlooked, invalidated, or dismissed, which doesn't make that experience go away. So when we have these different experiences of trauma that show up for neurodivergent individuals, healing from that isn't just like getting rid of some symptoms, right? Healing is about rebuilding the experience of safety in the body, rebuilding trust in my internal experience and in my ability to know what I need, and creating environments that fit my nervous system's needs rather than adapting my nervous system to everyone else. Increasing agency, increasing choice, and allowing space for restoration, repair, and regulation to exist in greater periods than dysregulation. If this resonated for you, check out some of our other recordings and videos related to neurodivergent experience, or tune into our Unmasked support group for some direct connection related to lived experience.